congratulate you
Imagine being
because
11
this is
years
just
old,
phenomenal.
walking
So
onto a
you
film
give
set
yourself
for
a
the
little
first
pat on the
time,
back.
and having no idea that the character you are about to play will follow you for the rest of your life. For Emma Watson, Hermione Granger was never just a role. She grew up with Hermione. She went from being a child who loved the books to becoming one of the most recognizable young actresses on the planet, all while the world watched her grow up. But what happened after Harry Potter ended was not the simple fairy tale people imagined. Emma had spent more than a decade working on the same franchise, and eventually she had to ask herself a question that had nothing to do with
and
acting.
escape.
Who was she when she
that
wasn't
they're
Hermione?
kind of the same thing, because
The answer would lead her through university, activism, fashion, directing, writing, and eventually one of the longest breaks from acting of her career. And the most interesting part is that Emma has actually explained why she stepped away. The story begins long before the final Harry Potter film. By the time the franchise reached its later years, Emma was already dealing with something she had not expected when she first signed on as a child.
And he was a few years older.
Fame had
and
stopped
he had a
feeling like something
skateboard.
happening around her and started affecting her
And that
entire
just-
life. During the 2022 Harry Potter reunion, Emma looked back at the period around Order of the Phoenix and admitted that the fame had finally hit home in a big way. She also revealed that she had considered leaving the franchise. What makes that confession more powerful is that Emma didn't simply remember being overwhelmed. She went back and read an old diary entry from that period and realized something painful. She could see that she had been lonely. Think about what that means.
It's Seth Rogen.
Millions of people were watching Harry Potter, the films were becoming bigger every year, and Emma was one of the faces at the center of it all, yet privately she could still feel alone. Her decision to continue was ultimately her own. She said nobody had to convince her to finish the series, and she credited the fans for genuinely wanting the young cast to succeed and having their backs. But finishing Harry Potter did not magically make the pressure disappear.
It's a purple leather dress.
Emma
a
had
purple
already
leather
started
dress
trying
with
to build a life
Well,
outside the franchise while the films were still being made. In 2009, she enrolled at Brown University, and in 2011 she announced that she was taking some time away from her studies because the combination of finishing Harry Potter, acting projects, and being a student had become difficult to manage. Importantly, she never described this as abandoning education. She said she loved Brown and loved studying, and that she would still work towards her degree, even if it took longer than expected. That detail matters because the popular version of Emma's story often makes it sound like she simply escaped Hollywood and disappeared into a library. That is not what happened. Her real story was much more complicated. She was trying to balance several identities at once: actress, student, public figure, activist, and a young woman who had been famous since childhood. Eventually she did graduate from Brown with a degree in English literature, proving that her education was not some temporary distraction from her career. And while acting remained part of her life, Emma gradually became more interested in deciding what kind of life she actually wanted rather than simply accepting every opportunity that came her way. Her choices after Harry Potter made that increasingly obvious. She appeared in films including The Perks of Being a Wallflower, The Bling Ring, Noah, Beauty and the Beast, The Circle, and Little Women. At the same time, she became increasingly involved in activism, particularly around gender equality. Her work with UN Women and the He for She campaign gave her another public identity, one that existed completely outside Hermione. But the more Emma's career grew, the more she seemed to understand that fame itself came with a price. In 2017, while promoting Beauty and the Beast, she spoke openly about how strange it could feel to see herself through the public image surrounding her. Her life had been photographed, discussed, analyzed, and turned into headlines for years. She tried to maintain some normality and was known for avoiding unnecessary exposure, even while being one of the world's most recognizable actresses. Then something changed again. After Little Women, which was released in 2019, Emma stopped appearing in new films. And unlike a normal celebrity break that lasts a few months before another project arrives, hers stretched into years. For a long time, she did not offer a huge explanation. In fact, in 2025 she admitted that part of the reason she avoided press was because she didn't want to constantly explain what she was doing or when she would return. But when she finally spoke more openly about the break, the explanation was surprisingly simple. She had not stopped loving acting. In fact, she said she missed it deeply. What she did not miss was a particular part of the job, promoting and selling the finished project. Emma described that side of the industry as soul-destroying, explaining that she missed using her skills and missed the art itself, but felt she had spent too little time doing the part she actually enjoyed. That completely changes the way you can look at her absence. This was not Emma Watson declaring that she hated movies or wanted nothing to do with acting anymore. It was an actress who had spent almost her entire childhood and teenage years working, realizing that she wanted more control over what she created and how she lived. She also explained that she had been working on rebuilding her personal foundation, and that the time away had allowed her to explore things she had never really had the chance to explore before. Instead of rushing back into another huge franchise, she studied creative writing at Oxford, explored directing, and began working behind the camera. She described the decision to write, study, and direct as terrifying precisely because she had always been in front of the camera. And that is probably the most important part of Emma's story. After spending years being told who Hermione Granger was, she started experimenting with who Emma Watson could become. The girl who once spent her childhood learning lines and performing in front of cameras was now learning how to create without necessarily being the person everyone was watching. That is a completely different kind of challenge. There is also something revealing about how Emma talks about acting now. She has not rejected the craft itself. She has talked about missing the creative process and the feeling of acting, while being much less interested in the machinery surrounding it. In other words, she didn't necessarily walk away from acting because she stopped caring. She walked away long enough to figure out what she actually cared about. And that distinction is important. Because when you have been famous since childhood, making a normal decision can become almost impossible. Every career move becomes news. Every break becomes a mystery. Every relationship becomes speculation. Even choosing to study can become a headline. Emma's response has been to create more distance between herself and that constant noise. Her life after Harry Potter has not been empty.
Congratulate you, because this is just phenomenal, so you give yourself a little pat on the back.
She completed her degree, built a major reputation as an activist, worked in fashion and sustainability, explored directing and writing, and helped launch Renaissance, a gin brand with her brother Alex. She has also continued to make selective public appearances rather than disappearing completely. And there is another detail that makes her current position especially interesting. Emma's last film was Little Women, but she has never said she will never act again. Quite the opposite. In her 2025 interview, she made it clear that she misses the art of acting. What she seems far less willing to accept is returning simply because Hollywood expects her to. That may be the biggest difference between the Emma Watson who finished Harry Potter and the Emma Watson who exists today. At the end of the franchise, she was still figuring out how to separate herself from Hermione. Years later, she appears much more comfortable deciding what deserves her time. And maybe that is the real private moment that changed her life. Not one secret afternoon in a library, not one dramatic Hollywood meeting, and not some mysterious event that suddenly transformed everything. It was a much longer process. A young girl became Hermione, Hermione became one of the most famous characters in modern cinema, and Emma Watson eventually had to step back far enough to hear her own voice again. She once looked back at her Harry Potter years and found evidence of loneliness in her own diary. Years later, she could look at her life and say that stepping away had allowed her to rebuild, study, create, and find a healthier balance. And perhaps that is why her story after Harry Potter feels so different from the usual Hollywood success story. She did not spend the years after the biggest franchise of her childhood desperately trying to prove that she could become even more famous.
It's a purple leather dress with
She spent them figuring out what fame was actually worth to her. Hermione taught millions of people to value intelligence, courage, and standing up for what you believe in. Emma Watson's life after Hermione seems to have taught her something slightly different. Sometimes you have to step away from the thing that made you famous to discover what you want your life to mean without it. And after years of being watched, photographed, interviewed, and expected to keep moving, Emma finally gave herself something she had rarely been allowed to have since childhood: time to decide for herself what comes next.